Balaam and his donkey, the whole story. Hello again, it's Bible Scribe. Thank you for joining me. Balaam and his donkey, this is a story that intrigues Christians, well, really anyone who reads the Bible and finds this story. The idea of an animal just speaking in general is something outlandish, of course, to most people. So we're going to go through the story of Balaam today. Now, I find it interesting that in preparing for this, if you've been listening to my channel, you realize I've been preparing my work and my research on Balaam for probably about 3 weeks, maybe even longer. And there's a reason for that. We'll talk more about that reason as we get further into this story. But I have spent a lot of time on this story and a lot of time on the background of this story. So there will be more videos and more research to come out of this that I've already studied and mapped out. Oh yeah, and you may also wonder why I used the background that I've got. This magical book looks like spells and enchantments. You'll also learn about why that is appropriate for this story. But let's take this time tonight to look at Balaam and his donkey and the story that surrounds it. Background of Moab and Balaam. Now, in the case of Balaam, of course, this is found in Numbers chapter 22. And in lieu of just reading it straight from the book of Numbers, I found that this was also paralleled in the book of Jasher. So if we go to Jasher chapter 84, 85, 86, you're also going to get the same story about Balaam. However, you'll find it interesting that the details of his donkey and the events surrounding his donkey talking are not in the book of Jasher. It's much more abbreviated there than it is in the scriptures in the book of Numbers. So what I have done is like I oftentimes do with this type of situation, I have paralleled the two versions side by side. So what we'll do is we'll go down and mainly read Numbers 22, but when it's appropriate, we'll show also what Jasher is saying about this same scenario. There are some details in the book of Jasher that are going to give us insight specifically into who Balaam is and where he came from. So let's just start reading here, starting in Numbers chapter 22, verse 1, and that would also be paralleled in Jasher 85, verse 33. And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in the plains of Moab on this side of Jordan by Jericho. And the same thing is recorded really in Jasher chapter 85. Now, I did do a lot of study during this research to map out this information, so I know all of these locations. So let's just show that briefly. So you can see here on Google Earth that I have mapped out all of these different things in regards to this story. Specifically, I have gotten very familiar with the areas talked about in both the book of Numbers and the book of Jasher. And so when we're looking at the area, of course, this is the area of Palestine. And just to give you your bearings, Jerusalem is right here in the center of your screen. Right there. And if we back away a little bit, now, if you remember here in verse 1 of Numbers 22, it says that Israel set forward and pitched in the plains of Moab on the side of Jordan by Jericho. So what's interesting is we do know a lot about this area at the time we're talking. Now, you'll notice these big colored areas. Now, I tried to map out with those colors the areas of the different people groups that lived in the area. And what you may notice, it's a little hard to see, but this area here at the bottom that's in purple is Moab. So all of this area in here, so that's where all the Moabites lived. And honestly, the borders changed over time. So I'm realizing that perhaps the borders of Moab actually came up a little further into this area instead of just this area at the bottom. But nevertheless, Moab was on the east side of the Dead Sea. Now it says that Israel camped on the side of the Jordan near Jericho. Well, Jericho is actually up here at the north end of the Dead Sea, and I'll circle it on the map right here. This is Jericho. So you can imagine that the Israelites were probably camping in this plain area near the Jordan, okay? Because that is, of course, near the area of Moab. Again, like I said, the borders were probably a little higher north. But you can see that this is the area that is being talked about in this first verse. So if we go to verse 2, it says, Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Now the background on Balak is that he was the king of Moab at this time. And it's interesting because the reason he became king was that Moab was afraid of Israel. So when Israel had camped in this area we're talking about, Israel was camping in this plain. This is right after they had just finished coming back down from the north. They came back down from the north because this area up here to the east of the Sea of Galilee was where Og of Bashan ruled. And he ruled over Amorites in this area. Og of Bashan was a giant. And if I'm not mistaken, he ruled with his brother, who was also a giant, obviously. But Israel had traveled up to this area and attacked and killed Og of Bashan by the hand of God. And then they traveled back down south and then camped in this plain near the Jordan and near Jericho. Okay. So that was the precedent for what you're hearing now in these verses. So the Moabites had heard of this, some may had seen it, and they were afraid of the Israelites. So they established a king over them, Balak, so that they could start fortifying and getting ready for what they saw as an oncoming battle they were going to have with Israel. So that is how Israel got to this area. And of course, this would be, I think, at the time, bordering on the border of Moab over here. And of course, Moab is down here, and they're afraid for their lives because of what has been happening. As Israel has been going through the land, they have defeated Og of Bashan, the giant, and his Amorite warriors. And then also, they had actually just prior come from this side, the western side of the Dead Sea, where in this area, they had defeated the king Arad and his men in the place called Hormah, which is right there on your map. So they were instilling fear in all of these lands and with all these people. So Moab was no different. So now that we know what's going on, let's go back to our passage and read a little further. Verse 3 in Numbers 22. And Moab was sore afraid of the people, meaning the Israelites, because they were many, and Moab was distressed because of the children of Israel. And as it says over here in verse 34 of Jasher 85, it says that the children of Moab had heard all the evil which the children of Israel had done to the two kings of the Amorites, to both Sihon and Og of Bashan. So all the men of Moab were greatly afraid of them. Numbers 22, verse 4, And Moab said to the elders of Midian, Now shall this company, meaning the Israelites, they will lick us up, and all that are around us, as the ox licks up the grass of the field. And Balak the son of Zippor, as we said, was king of the Moabites at that time. And in Jasher 85:35, you see them saying similar things, but that they were afraid because of their victories in these different battles. Numbers 22, verse 5. So he, meaning Balak, the king of Moab, sent messengers, therefore, to Balaam, the son of Beor. Okay, so this is Balaam. And he says to call to him, saying, Behold, there is a people come out of Egypt. Behold, they cover the face of the earth, and they abide over against me. Come now, therefore, I pray thee, curse me this people, for they are too mighty for me. Peradventure I shall prevail, that we may smite them, that I may drive them out of the land. For I wot that he whom thou blessed is blessed, and he whom thou cursed is cursed. So you see here Balak putting full confidence in Balaam to curse Israel for him and deliver Israel into his hands. Now, it's interesting. The reason that Balak believes that Balaam can do this is because of something that had already happened in history. And that is actually in Jasher 84. So if we went back in Jasher just a little bit, you would see that this king that Balak's talking about, King Sihon, he's a king of the Amorites. Now, King Sihon actually presided over the areas to the northeast of the land of Moab. So King Sihon had reigned in this area up here. And what had happened was, in Jasher chapter 84, it recounts that Sihon waged war against Moab at one point prior to the Israelites coming into town. Sihon had attacked Moab, and what had happened before he did that was that he brought this same magician, the sorcerer, Balaam, and his father, Beor, which was already mentioned in the passage. He brought them to his land to curse Moab before they went in battle against them. And of course, the curse worked in that case, and Sihon and the Amorites defeated Moab and took the city of Heshbon, which is right here on your map, city of Heshbon. So the Amorites and Sihon had come south, and with the curse of Balaam and Beor on their side, had defeated the Moabites and taken over their city, Heshbon. So Balak, when he calls Balaam forth, the reason is because he knows that that guy's curses work. He's known as a magician, a sorcerer, and his curses have effect. He has power. So in the case of the Israelites, Balak is afraid, and so he calls this magician, Balaam, that he knows can have some effect on the outcome of this battle. So let's read Numbers 22, verse 7. It says, "The elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the rewards of divination in their hand, and they came unto Balaam and spake unto him the words of Balak." So they delivered the message. Now, you notice that Midian is mentioned here. At this point, the leaders of Moab had allied themselves with Midian. Now, you may remember Midian from the stories about Moses. Moses married a Midianite named Zipporah. And so I'll show you on the map where Midian was. So here's where the Israelites were camping, and then Moab is here in this zone. So if we scroll back out, zoom out a little bit, to the south of Moab is Edom. That is this big yellow area. And if we continue to go south, this green block shows the area of Midian. You'll notice that right in the middle of Midian is Jebel Elaz, the mountain that we know as Mount Sinai in the Bible, where God gave Moses the tablets and the law. But this is Midian. It's right in the center of Midian, this area. And so Moab had called forth Midian to ally themselves also against the Israelites. So the Midianites sent their armies up to Moab like this, and then prepared to fight the Israelites, who were amassing, of course, to their north in this area. And Moab, of course, all this area here. So the Moabites had allied with Midian, and they were all amassing forces here to get ready for the battle they thought was coming. Now, 22 verse 8, he said unto them, said unto these messengers, "Lodge here this night, and I will bring you word again, as the Lord shall speak unto me." And the princes of Moab abode with Balaam. So the elders or princes of Moab that had gone to ask for Balaam's curse, for him to come back with them and then curse Israel, Balaam has asked them to stay the night so he can hear a word from the Lord, so to speak, about what he would do. Balaam's journey on the donkey. Now, the next section that's in Numbers, chapter 22, verse 9 and forward, has to do with the donkey narrative, the story of his decision on whether or not he should go to Moab, and then his journey on the donkey that he has this extraordinary encounter with. So we'll just read in Numbers because this account is not in the book of Jasher. So starting in verse 9 of Numbers 22, and God came to Balaam and said, who are these men that are with you? Balaam said to God, Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent to me, saying, behold, there is a people come out of Egypt, which covers the face of the earth. Come now, curse them for me. Peradventure I shall be able to overcome them and drive them out. But God says to Balaam, you shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. Of course, Israelites were God's nation, his chosen nation. While all the other nations had been divvied out among the angels, God kept Israel for himself, and this was all after the Tower of Babel and the scattering of the nations. Verse 13, and Balaam rose up in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, go into your land, for the Lord refuses to give me leave to go with you. So at first here we see Balaam recognizing God's voice and heeding it, because God had told him not to go with them, not to go and curse the Israelites, because they were blessed. So at first, Balaam is being obedient and telling the messengers from Moab that he will not go with them. But verse 14, the princes of Moab rose up and went to Balak and said that Balaam refused to come with us. And Balak, the king of Moab, sent yet again princes, more and more honorable than they were. And those princes came to Balaam, and they said to him, thus says Balak the son of Zippor, let nothing, I pray thee, hinder thee from coming to me, for I will promote you to very great honor, and I will do whatsoever you say to me. Come therefore, I pray you, curse me this people. So they up the ante a little bit. Balak sends back new messengers, more distinguished messengers, and they tell Balaam that if he comes, then he will be granted wealth, prosperity, a great honor in Balak's kingdom. And Balaam answered and said unto the servants of Balak, if Balak would give me this house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do less or more. So Balaam seems to be heeding again the word of the Lord in this case, and tells them he will not go. He says, now therefore I pray you, tarry ye also here this night, that I may know what the Lord will say unto me more. Now this is honestly maybe a mistake on Balaam's part, because although the Lord has now told him twice that he should not go to Moab and he should not curse the people of Israel, he still tells them to wait and see if he hears any more word from God. Essentially kind of saying, well, maybe God will change his mind, which seems to me to be almost like toying with God a little bit. Verse 20, and God came to Balaam that night and said to him, if the men come to call thee, rise up and go with them. But yet the word which I shall say unto thee, that shalt thou do. So in this case, it sounds like God just tells Balaam to go on and go with them, but you have to say everything I tell you to say. Verse 21, and Balaam rose up in the morning and saddled his ass and went with the princes of Moab. So he gets on his donkey and he starts out on the long journey back to Moab. And remember, this is a long journey. So just so you are aware, Balaam and his father Beor are from Egypt. So we're talking about, of course, this area over here in the Nile Delta is the most likely place for their kingdom headquarters. And of course, Moab over here. So the journey back and forth between these two is not to be trifled with. This is a long journey. In fact, I can show you the distance here on the map. The distance is 276 miles. So this is a long journey to get between these two areas. And they may have broken up the journey slightly with some sort of ship ride in the sea, perhaps, to shorten the walk. But regardless, this is a long journey. It took days and days to make this journey. Verse 22, and God's anger was kindled because he went. Now, this is something that a lot of people ask about, because they say, well, if God told him in the previous verse to go ahead and go with these people from Moab, then Why is God now angry with him because he went? Well, it's probably because God told him twice in a row not to go, and he still ignored it and waited for another answer from God. So maybe this is kind of God's way of maybe punishing him in a sense by saying, oh yeah, go ahead and go then, Balaam. You will see what happens, kind of thing. And we do see something amazing happen in the next few verses. So obviously God was not happy with Balaam at this point, even though he went ahead and said the third time for him to go ahead and go to Moab. It says that God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the way for an adversary against him. Now he was riding upon his ass or his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. Verse 23, and the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand. So at this point, the donkey sees the angel with his sword out, but Balaam does not see the angel at all. And we can only assume that neither did the servants that were with him see the angel. And the donkey, seeing the angel, turned aside out of the way and went into the field. And Balaam, being angry at the donkey and not knowing about the angel, whipped the donkey. Of course, probably had, one of those kind of flimsy whipping sticks that kind of just gets the donkey's attention. So he was probably whipping it to try to get it to turn back into the path they were on instead of going off into the field. Verse 24, but the angel of the Lord stood in a path of the vineyards, a wall being on this side and a wall on that side. And so at some point, Balaam and his donkey had kind of ridden into an area between 2 vineyards or something where the path was rather narrow, and there were walls on each side to, of course, separate the vineyards. And verse 25 tells us that when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord again, she thrust herself into the wall and smashed Balaam's foot against the wall. So as they're going through this path again, Balaam's trying to get the donkey back on track. The donkey sees this angel again and freaks out and hits against the wall and smashes Balaam's foot. And of course, Balaam gets mad, starts hitting the donkey again with his little stick. Verse 26, and the angel of the Lord went further and stood in a narrow place, where there was no way to turn either to the right hand or to the left. So with Balaam riding the donkey in this narrow area between these 2 walls, and there's nowhere for the donkey to go, the donkey's scared, it's got Balaam's leg pinned up against the wall. It says in verse 27, when the donkey saw again the angel of the Lord, she fell down then under Balaam. And Balaam's anger was kindled, and he smote the donkey again with the staff. And the Lord then opens the mouth of the donkey. So just imagine this again. They're between these 2 walls in these vineyards. There's nowhere for them to go, either the donkey or Balaam, because it's a narrow path, and the angel is right in front of them. And finally, the donkey just sits down on the ground. Balaam's still sitting on it, probably still hitting it with a stick. And then God opens the mouth of the donkey, and it says in verse 28, she says unto Balaam, what have I done to you that you have smitten me these 3 times? And Balaam says to the donkey in verse 29, because you have mocked me, I wished that there was a sword in my hand, for I would kill you. And the donkey then in verse 30 says to Balaam, am I not your donkey, upon which you have ridden ever since I was yours unto this day? Was I ever wont to do so unto you? And he said, nay. Then at that point, when Balaam realized he's talking to a donkey, the Lord opens his eyes. This is verse 31. And he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way, and his sword drawn in his hand. And he bowed down his head and fell flat on his face. So Balaam, now probably off the donkey, gets off the donkey and bows before this angel he now sees that the donkey had been running from the whole time. Verse 32, the angel of the Lord says to Balaam, why have you smitten your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I went out to withstand you because your way is perverse before me. So perhaps this also helps us answer the question of why God allowed Balaam to go on the way. Because after 2 times of ignoring God, and God finally on the 3rd time saying, go ahead and do it, God maybe then was planning to send his angel to force Balaam to turn back. Verse 33, and the donkey saw me and turned from me these 3 times. This is the angel talking. And if she had not turned from me, surely I would have slain you and saved her alive. So the angel tells Balaam that if the donkey hadn't turned away from me, I would have just killed you where you stand. So that probably was God's plan. Because Balaam had been disobedient, the angel was sent really to slay Balaam. And instead, the donkey actually saved his life by turning away. Verse 34, and Balaam said unto the angel of the Lord, I have sinned, for I knew not that you stood in the way against me. Now therefore, if it displease thee, I will go back again. So he does repent in this case. He says, I have sinned, and if it is okay, I will leave and go back where I came from. So he's going to go back to Egypt. But the angel of the Lord in verse 35 says to Balaam, go with the men, but only the word that I speak to thee shall you speak. So Balaam went ahead and went with the princes of Balak. And I think you'll see in a minute what it is that God has in store when Balaam gets to Moab. Balaam and Moab. So this is when the story of Balaam picks back up in both versions, both the version from Numbers 22 and the version from Jasher chapter 85. Verse 36 says, when Balak heard that Balaam was come, he went out to meet him in a city of Moab, which is in the border of Arnon, which is the utmost coast. And Balaam said to Balak, did I not earnestly send unto you to call you? Wherefore came you not unto me? Am I not able indeed to promote you to honor? And Balaam said to Balak, lo, I am come unto you. Have I now any power to say at all anything? The word that God puts in my mouth, that will I speak. So Balak is upset that Balaam takes so long to get there, but finally he's there, with the caveat that Balaam says he's only going to say what God allows him to say, what God tells him to say. Verse 39 of Numbers 22, Balaam went with Balak, and they came to Kirjath-Huzoth. And Balak offered oxen and sheep, and sent to Balaam and to the princes that were with him. And it came to pass on the morrow that Balak took Balaam, and brought him up into the high places of Baal, that he might see the utmost part of the people. And Balaam said to Balak, build me here 7 altars, prepare me 7 oxen and 7 rams. And Balak did as Balaam had spoken. And Balak and Balaam offered on every altar a bullock and a ram. And Balaam said to Balak, stand by thy burnt offering, and I will go. Peradventure the Lord will come to meet me, and whatsoever he shows me I will tell you. And he went to an high place, and God met Balaam. So get the picture here before we move on. Balak had sent for Balaam. Balaam took forever to get there. He finally gets there. So Balaam, this sorcerer, this magician, this renowned wise man of Egypt, is there. And Balak takes him up to their high places, their places of worship of false gods. And they build these altars. Oxen and ram are prepared and sacrificed and put on altars. This is all in preparation for Balaam conjuring a curse against Israel. Or at least that's Balak's plan. But then Balaam says, when they have all this prepared, he says to Balak, well, I'm going to have to go and see what the Lord has for me to say, okay? So Balaam is staying with the program at this point, with God's program. Verse 4, chapter 23 of Numbers, God met Balaam, and he said unto him, I've prepared 7 altars, and offered on every altar a bullock and a ram. And the Lord put a word in Balaam's mouth, and said, return to Balak, and thus you shall speak. And Balaam returned to him, and stood by the burnt sacrifice, he and all the princes of Moab, and took up this parable, and said, Balak, the king of Moab, has brought me from Aram, out of the mountains of the east, saying, come, curse me, Jacob, and come defy Israel. How shall I curse whom God has not cursed? Or how shall I defy whom the Lord has not defied? That should give you the flavor of this parable that Balaam is now saying in front of Balak. that Balaam is refusing, as God has ordered, he's refusing to curse Israel. Now, this parable goes on and on until verse 12, but essentially it's a refusal as far as Balak is concerned. Balak says unto him in verse 13, Come, I pray with you, into another place, from whence you may seest them. Thou shalt see the utmost part of them, and shalt not see them all, and curse them from there. So he brought him into the field of Zophim to the top of Pisgah, and built 7 altars, and offered a bullock and ram on every altar again. And the same thing happens again. The Lord meets with Balaam and tells him what to say. Balaam gives another parable, a second parable. So Balaam speaks this second parable, and of course it's the same content. It talks about God bringing Israel out of Egypt, making them strong, etc., and that he cannot curse the people of Israel. It goes all the way to verse 26 of Numbers 23. Balaam says, in verse 27, Balak says to Balaam, Come, I pray you, I will bring you to another place. So maybe it will please God that you may curse me from there. So again, they go through the same exercise. Balak really wants this curse because his people are afraid of Israel and he's afraid of Israel. And the same thing happens again. Balaam lifts his eyes and sees Israel abiding in their tents according to their tribes, and the Spirit of God comes upon him, and he takes up another parable. Now, we're in chapter 24 of Numbers. Verse 12, Balaam says to Balak, Speak I not also to thy messengers which thou sent me, saying, If Balak would give me his house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the commandment of the Lord, to do either good or bad of my own mind, but speak what the Lord says. So Balaam is telling them again, I can only do what the Lord has told me. I mean, Balaam knew that God would have killed him if he disobeyed again. This is him being true to his own fear of the Lord, but to the fact that he knows he can't do anything outside of what God wants him to do. Now, at the end of this parable, Balak is upset. This is the third time that Balak has tried to get this curse out of Balaam. His anger was kindled against Balaam, and he smote his hands together, and Balak said to him, I called thee to curse my enemies, and behold, you have altogether blessed them 3 times. Therefore now flee to your own place. I thought to promote you to great honor, but lo, the Lord has kept you back from honor. Balak is laying the law down, and he says, just get out of here. Balaam did not do the curse that he wanted. Instead, as he said, Balaam was actually blessing the Israelites, and this was from God. And so Balak tells Balaam to take off and go back home, that he would have given him all the greatest honors that Moab had to offer, but he's sending him home because he would not curse Israel. Verse 14, Balaam says, And now, behold, I go to my people. Come, therefore, I will advertise thee what this people shall do to your people in latter days. And he took up a parable and said, Now, this parable is the 4th of the parables that Balaam gives. And this is actually, he mentions a lot of different nations that Israel is going to defeat in the coming years. So he talks about Moab, Edom. He talks about Amalek, the Kenites, Asher. He talks about all these different nations that will be defeated by the Israelites. And he gives this parable right in front of Balak. So this is a frightening thing for Balak, of course, to hear. So now we come to verse 25 in chapter 24 of Numbers. Balaam rose up and went and returned to his place, and Balak also went back to Moab. The trouble with Midianites. And in chapter 25 of Numbers, the first verse, Israel abode then in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. Now, I'll just kind of verbally tell you about what happens in this whole section of the story. If we go to the book of Jasher's account, Jasher 85, verse 52, it says that Israel abode in the plain of Shittim and began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. Now, you may ask yourself, where is the plain of Shittim? Well, as we said before, the plain that they were in was on the side of the Jordan near Jericho. So they were over here in this plain. Well, the plain of Shittim is actually just on the other side of the Jordan. So they had moved across, of course, closer to the boundaries of Moab. And now we're starting to commit whoredoms with the Moabite women. You may or may not remember this story, but remember that the Midianites had come and they were now with the Moabites. So there were both Moabites and Midianites in this area of Moab. And now the Israelites were over here to the east of the Jordan, near their boundaries. And the Moabites and Midianites were trying to figure out what to do. So what they ended up deciding to do, and this is recounted, of course, in Numbers 25 and in Jasher 85, the Moabites come up with this plan because they're so afraid of the Israelites just destroying them. So the Moabite and Midianite women start dressing up and adorning themselves with gold and silver to seduce the Israelites into the tents of the Moabites. And then they're getting them well fed and drunk and then having sex with them. And this is all in an effort to make them docile and not want to fight. And they were also causing them to eat food when they were drunk that was sacrificed to their idols. So it was their way of not only dehumanizing and weakening the armies of Israel, but also defiling them. But if you remember this story, then God gets upset with Israel for doing this, for being seduced by the Moabites and Midianites. And he sends a plague, a pestilence on Israel, and 24,000 Israelite men who engaged in this promiscuity were killed. And then later on in the book of Jasher, chapter 86, it talks about how the Israelites got revenge on Midian for that seduction that they participated in against Israel. All of this comes full circle in the end. And in Numbers chapter 31, verse 8, let's go there really quick. You'll see here that they slew the kings of Midian, beside the rest of them that were slain, namely Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, 5 kings of Midian. Balaam also, the son of Beor, they slew with the sword. Because actually, in those prior verses in Numbers, it said that Balaam had gone home, but then also gone to Midian. So he had gone to Egypt, but then took residence in Midian for a time. And so he was there when the Israelites came down into Midian after all of this Moabite stuff had gone on. And God had them take out vengeance on the Midianites. And Balaam was there and was slain along with them. Talking animals is absurd. So that's the end of Balaam. Now, so there's a couple things I'd like to talk about briefly. And one is the idea of an animal talking. And I just wanted to bring this up because if that sounds so outlandish to you, you know, it's just like, wow, that's ridiculous. You know, that's what some people would say makes the Bible seem like fairy tales, right? Well, it's interesting. Of course, we do have the account in Genesis of the serpent talking to Eve and deceiving her into eating the fruit of the garden. But we also see in the book of Jubilees, let me pull this up really fast for you here. In the book of Jubilees, chapter 3, verse 26, and he, meaning God, made for them coats of skin and clothed them and sent them forth from the Garden of Eden. And on that day which Adam went forth from the Garden of Eden, he offered a sweet savor, an offering, frankincense, galbanum, stacte, and spices in the morning with the rising of the sun from the day when he covered his shame. And on that day, verse 28 of the book of Jubilees, chapter 3, on that day was closed the mouth of all beasts and all cattle and birds, and of whatever walks and whatever moves, so that they could no longer speak. For they had all spoken with one another with one lip and one tongue. So according to this writing, prior to God sending Adam out of the garden, and by the way, in verse 29, it says he sent all flesh out of the garden, all beasts and all animals and creatures all according to their kinds unto their places that had been created for them on the earth. So when all the animals were in the garden, before Adam had been sent out, apparently, according to this writing, all the animals could talk. All the animals, it says, and Adam and Eve, they all spoke one language together. So it may not be as far-fetched to think that an animal could speak as Balaam's donkey did. Magical roots. Now, one other thing I want to talk about before we finish up, and we've gone through this parallel account of Balaam and his donkey and all the other things related to Balaam. And as I said, this is a parallel account between Jasher and Numbers, but I have put some other things at the top of this page, and this page is on my website. And I will have the link in the description of the video for you, so you can go to it yourself. But an interesting thing as I studied, so let me just show you what I first did when I started studying Balaam. I did this. I searched all the codices in my application for Balaam, of course. Very simple search to start out with. And I saw that, wow, it's in the Bible and it's in Jasher. Now, if you'll notice in Jasher, when we were reading through, we were paralleling Numbers 22 with Jasher 84 and 85 and 86. But you can see Balaam is mentioned all the way back in Jasher 61. So for 20 chapters or more, there is some discussion on and off about Balaam. Now, what I found out is I really studied deeply into this, and I read all of those chapters in Jasher from the 60s all the way up to the 80s. So I knew the entire narrative and I mapped it all out. But what I found was that the Balaam in the beginning parts of Jasher is not the same Balaam as the Balaam we just talked about, okay? So here's the rub. Here's where it gets interesting. Jasher 84:16 says that Beor, the son of Jenius, and Balaam his son, Balaam is the son of Beor, the son of Jenius or Janus. Okay, now realize that is Jasher 84. That's where we were reading in parallel with Numbers. So this is the Balaam we were talking about. Balaam, the son of Beor, just as we read in our passage. So as far as lineage, Balaam is the son of Beor, and Beor is the son of Janius or Janus. Now, in verse 15 of that same passage, Beor, the son of Janius, son of Balaam. Interesting. Counselor to the king of Egypt. So Janius or Janus is the son of Balaam, the counselor sorcerer of Egypt. This is a different Balaam. So we have to get our lineage straight. Of course, names were reused generationally in family lines. In Jasher 79, verse 27, this statement is made. Now, this is when Moses and Aaron were standing before Pharaoh, telling him to let the Israelites go out of Egypt. Pharaoh sent for Balaam the magician, and to Janus and Jambres his sons, and all the magicians and conjurers and counselors that belonged to the king. So, now we know that Janus and Jambres were the sons of Balaam, not the Balaam with the donkey, but his great-grandfather, Balaam, the counselor or sorcerer of Egypt at the time of Moses. So now we understand, and this links us to the time of Moses when Moses and Aaron threw down their rod before Pharaoh, and it became a snake. And then who were the magicians, the sorcerers of Egypt, the sorcerers of Pharaoh that threw down their rods that became snakes? The people standing there were Balaam, the Balaam with the donkey's great-grandfather Balaam, and his two sons, Janus and Jambres. So you see that the Balaam with the donkey, his lineage comes straight from these magicians, these sorcerers who had fought against Moses and Aaron in Egypt over the people of Israel. So I hope that puts into perspective why Balak coveted the counsel of this Balaam. His great-grandfather had been known throughout the lands as one of the greatest sorcerers of all time. And if we went through all the stories that I read about Balaam and the great-grandfather Balaam and his exploits, his things he did, you would be amazed. For instance, even in the book of Jasher, there's some detail around the incident I just mentioned with the rods that turned into snakes. It's interesting that in that account, in Jasher, we all know that Moses' rod, or his snake rather, ate the snakes of the other magicians, the Egyptian magicians. So his rod devoured theirs. Well, the detail that's added in the book of Jasher is that when Moses and Aaron threw down their staff and it became the snake, that the magicians, Jannes and Jambres and Balaam, great-grandfather Balaam, they complained and told the Pharaoh that this is just a trick, and that even if he eats these snakes, that anyone can do that. It is a well-known trick of sorcery to make a snake eat other snakes. So Balaam in this case suggests to the Pharaoh to make them turn their staff, meaning Moses and Aaron, turn their staff back into a rod, and then if it devours the other ones, then they would be true. And so what does God allow them to do? Actually, in this account, the rods all, even the sorcerer's rods and Moses' rod, turn back into rods, staffs, and then his rod devours the magician's rods, which is even more incredible. So it's almost like they just got sucked into it and were gone, vanished. Moses' rod destroyed all of the other rods after they were rods again, not while they were snakes. So that's just a little bit of the interesting detail that the book of Jasher has brought to some of these stories. And again, there's many stories I read that I want to do more content on because it's so interesting. It's so interesting to understand. It's so interesting to see the different wars and battles that went on. By the way, the Italian peninsula comes into all these wars. The people of the land of Chittim, which is Italy, and the Tuscanites, the Tuscany people from the land of Tuscany in Italy, and the Sardinians, and all these different peoples. It's all talked about in the book of Jasher. It was very amazing and interesting. And I do have a lot more interesting information to present to you guys on some of that. So be looking out for that in the future. Wrap up. But I hope that this time spent on Balaam is something you've enjoyed and you've learned a lot about the scenario that occurred when Balak, the king of Moab, sent for Balaam, the great grandson of Balaam the great magician from Egypt, in his attempt to get a curse put on the people of Israel. And God was not going to allow that to happen. So I hope this helps. And until next time, thanks and God bless.